Welcome to ReMemory, Experiments in Listening, Authorship, and Knowledge Keeping. In this series, we highlight the work of artists, scholars, and knowledge keepers whose work attend to what Toni Morrison describes as the pitched battle between remembering and forgetting. The reparative labor of ReMemory invites us to recognize the ways that we are intimately bound up with the undocumented or underdocumented histories and the urgent need for reconstituting and recollecting a usable past. Kenyan author and scholar Ngugi wa Thiong'o, whose work seeks to redress the historical amnesia and dismemberment of the colonial enterprise, sees memory as, quote, the site of dreams and of desire, is thus crucial to the construction of our being. So the second event of this series is featuring the creators of the forthcoming audio documentary, When We All Get to Heaven, Lynne Gerber, Ariana Nedelman, and Siri Colom. When We All Get to Heaven is a documentary project that tells the story of one of the first gay-positive churches, the Metropolitan Community Church of San Francisco, and how it faced the personal, social, and political trials of the AIDS epidemic, including the deaths of 500 of its members. The forthcoming project is based on an archive of 1,200 cassette tapes recorded by the congregation during the height of the AIDS epidemic. And so this event will feature a short talk by Gerber, Nedelman, and Colom, followed by a Q&A with the audience, you all. And then, so I ask that you, as you're listening, please prepare questions. I think for full transparency, I have worked with Lynn, Ariana, and Siri on this project, but I invited them not because of nepotism, but because I've found each of them individually to be brilliant thinkers and creative minds in thinking about what it means to work with and narrativize archival material and what it means to give voice to and to highlight so much of the themes that we've just talked about in that description when it comes to memory and authorship. So please join me in welcoming Lynn, Ariana, and Siri. As a quick sort of biography, Lynne Gerber is an independent scholar and a co-founder of Eureka Street Productions. Her research interests are in places where religion, morality, and the body overlap. She's held research positions and taught at Harvard Divinity School and the University of California at Berkeley, and her recent work focuses on religious responses to the emergence of HIV and AIDS in the 1980s and 90s in San Francisco. Ariana Nedelman is the co-founder of Not Sorry Productions and the co-creator and producer of the upcoming independent audio project, When We All Get to Heaven. She has her BA from the University of Chicago and a graduate certificate from the Salt Institute of Documentary Studies. And Siri Colom is an assistant professor of sociology at Worcester State University. Her research focuses on race, environment, and urban politics, with a particular focus on the ways communities come apart and together after disasters. She uses the lens of sociology to think about how structural oppression manifests and emerges in the everyday politics of people attempting to rebuild lives and homes. She holds a PhD in sociology from the University of California, Berkeley. And their bios are much longer than what I just read and much more interesting. And so I hope you'll go and look at the Eventbrite and research all of the interesting works that they are all individually doing. But I'm excited again to introduce you to all of them. I've had the pleasure of working with them and being in conversation with them about this work. And I know that you will be moved and inspired by what they have to say. So let's welcome them and thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Sarah. It's Worcester, just for the future.
I was wondering, I was like, Worcestershire? Worcester? Different on the page.
So I'm Ariana. I am with Lynn and Siri. I'm just going to reiterate a little bit of what Sarah already said to you. Together, we are the collective Eureka Street Productions, and we're working on an upcoming project called When We All Get to Heaven. And that project tells the story of how a group of gay Christians created their own church. And let me try that again. It's how a group of gay Christians started a church for gay Christians, and how they navigated the AIDS epidemic in the 80s and 90s in San Francisco. And tonight what we're going to do is tell you a little bit about how we came to this project, how we found one another, how we started to imagine taking recordings of church services and turning those services into some kind of narrative podcast experience. We're going to play some clips, And the first thing we're going to do is tell you a little bit about the church and the history of the church, and Lynn is going to take that over.
Hi all, it is just a pleasure and an honor to be here, and thanks Sarah for having us here. It's a total gift to be able to talk about our work with new ears, so thank you all for being here. I am supposed to give you a very short overview of what the Metropolitan Community Church of San Francisco is. Good luck to me speaking quickly. We'll see how that goes. The short answer is MCC San Francisco is a queer church. It was located in the Castro in the years that we're talking about, which some of you may know is the most visible queer neighborhood in San Francisco, mostly a gay male neighborhood in San Francisco. MCC San Francisco is one congregation. It's one church in a larger movement called the Metropolitan Community Churches, or it used to be called the Universal Fellowship of Metropolitan Community Churches. And that denomination or that movement was founded by a guy named Reverend Troy Perry. Troy Perry was a Pentecostal minister, is a Pentecostal minister, and an out gay man. He was part of a very conservative denomination called the Church of God and Prophecy, and he was on two different pulpits. He had two different ministerial positions in very conservative Pentecostal churches. He was kicked out of both when it was revealed that he was gay. The second time he was like, this isn't going to work out. I seem to be gay and I think God's all right with that. So I am moving on. He took a couple of years away from church, and then in the late 60s, he believed that God was calling him to start a new ministry to gay and lesbian people, to start a church that would be open to gay and lesbian people, by gay and lesbian people, a church that wouldn't require them to consider their sexuality a sin, that wouldn't consider it something that needed to be repented or gotten absolution for or considered a sin in any way, but that it was something that God knew when God created people, and therefore God was fine, and therefore we should all be fine. One of the things that's different about MCC, one way to think about what is unique about that experiment, is that at the same time, a lot of denominations that you might have heard about, the sort of big Christian groups like the Methodists and the Lutherans and the United Church of Christ and these people and those people, they all had queer people in them. And in most of those denominations, there was like a nucleus of queer people who were trying to think about how they could get inclusion in the Lutheran Church, the Episcopal Church. The folks who started MCC were like, we don't need inclusion in the Lutheran Church, the MCC Church. We're starting our own space, our own experiment with the premise that gay is good. We are not having an argument with 20 layers of bishops and priests and these people and those people and theologians and yada, yada, yada to have some kind of big biblical argument. We are starting with gay is good, that is fine, God blesses it, and we're going to go from there. And that's a really different perspective and a really different kind of gay religion work that was happening in the period. So San Francisco was the second congregation founded in this. The first one was founded in Los Angeles by Troy Perry. San Francisco was the second church. It was founded in 1970 at Jackson's Bar, which was a gay bar in the North Beach neighborhood. It was founded, I'll just add, Troy Perry founded MCC in 1968, which is a year before Stonewall. Howard Wells founded MCC San Francisco in 1970, which was actually a couple of months after Stonewall by the time he started it. And in 1970, the Castro hadn't really quite consolidated as the gay neighborhood. There was a lot of queer spaces, a lot of queer neighborhoods all over the city, which they are still too. But it's the 1970s when the Castro really consolidated as like the visible gay male neighborhood of San Francisco that became kind of iconic in the popular imagination. And in 1979, MCC San Francisco bought a little building on Eureka Street in the Castro, 3 blocks from where Harvey Milk had his camera store, and set up a presence and a permanent home in the Castro. 1979 was 3 years, I can't do math, 2 years before the first public reports of what we would come to understand to be AIDS. The first public reports about AIDS came out in the summer of 1981, and San Francisco had a unique role to play in the early AIDS epidemic. It was one of the 3 cities that were hardest hit. Were in the kind of the first wave of AIDS cases: New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. New York and Los Angeles had more raw numbers of people with AIDS, but the thing that was unique about San Francisco is that it had the highest density of cases. So while there might have been more numbers in New York, there were just so many more people in New York that the effect of that socially was kind of diluted. San Francisco was a small city, 12-mile square, and the Castro was a small neighborhood. And most of the AIDS cases, particularly the early ones, were really deeply clustered in the Castro. So it was a very intimate neighborhood, street by street, very dense situation. It wasn't just a question of you getting sick, or maybe your lover getting sick, or maybe your friend. It quickly became your grocer, your postman, your butcher, your bartender. It was a very socially dense and intimate struggle. And like I said, it was the dentist in the Castro, and MCC was the neighborhood church of the Castro, and the only church by and for queer people. So there were other churches in the Castro. There was a Catholic church in the Castro at the time, Most Holy Redeemer. Some gay Catholics made that their home, but as a place that recognized the mourners, like the partners of people who died of AIDS, who would give them the place of honor as mourners during the epidemic, the place that would recognize lovers and family and friends and the complicated realities of queer kinship, and that wouldn't ask anybody to renounce their sexuality in order to have a funeral there. MCC San Francisco was the site of that. And now I'm just going to go to just a little bit on how we got this tape. So I moved to San Francisco in 2001. Early on, I was invited to go to MCC San Francisco by a colleague. And I went and I became a friend of the congregation and I started just going. So I've been engaged in this conversation since 2001 now. I'm not a lesbian. I am not a Christian. But this church was like, if you're here, you're queer. We don't care. Just come, just show, just do. And that's what I did. I came and showed and did, and I'm still doing. And as the years went on and my academic interests moved toward sociology of religion, I proposed a project to think about how congregations deal with trauma by looking at how MCC San Francisco dealt with the trauma of losing so many people in the AIDS crisis. That was a project that went nowhere fast, but in the course of that, one of the longtime congregants told me that he had personally preserved this collection of audio tapes that had been designated for the garbage, which is shocking to think about. But he introduced me to this collection of what is 1,200 cassette tapes of recordings of church services, 2 services a Sunday, a morning service and an evening service, almost every week between 1987 and 2003. And along with the worship services, there are a couple of other kinds of tapes and events that were recorded for part of this. The church started recording their services because they wanted to give recordings to people who were too sick to come to church. And they had a sound professional in the congregation who was able to set up a sound room and get it together. So that's how we came to have access to these tapes. And I was introduced to the collection in 2011, and we have been engaging with this archive ever since then. And I'm going to kick it to Siri.
Meanwhile, I thought you all were looking at the, the pictures the whole time. Oh my goodness. You would think, listen, yeah, I'm a faculty member. I do this all the time. You would think I'd have it down. All right. A couple things is that we had hoped that I would be competent enough to be able to turn it off so you would see us in larger, as larger images, but I'm now nervous to touch anything. So I hope that in this next section, the sound plays and everything works. So what we're going to do is something a little bit different is we're going to do a little bit more of a personal introduction to ourselves and our connection to this archive through some clips. And so it's going to allow us to reflect on, there's different reasons that each of us chose the clips that we did, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But the pieces that we've chosen are definitely, I think, in some ways less academic and more about like what has kept us doing this project, which I don't know if either of you mentioned, but we as a collective have been doing this for 10 years. And we'll like touch on it a little bit. I think later on, Ariana's going to say something related to that. So, and if you have any questions, just note them if there's anything that you would like to talk about a little bit more. All right, so the first clip is actually, I believe, we still have it in, here's the archive. This I was supposed to show you a little while ago. Our next piece is a piece that Lynn is going to talk about. And before you start, Lynn, let's make sure that you're going to hear the sound. Can you give me a thumbs up if you hear it?
And what happens?
Yes. Oh, sorry, you're not supposed to see that. Okay. All right. Great. Excellent.
Okay, so we're starting with mine?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So we each were tasked with picking a clip that would help you get a sense of sounds that we heard in this archive that pulled us toward this project. And I will preface this by saying, when I started this project, I had just finished a book on very, very conservative evangelicals. I was a scholar of religion. I was studied the ex-gay movement and Christian weight loss programs. I had spent a lot of time in spaces that were not theologically nor religiously aligned with my own personal point of view. And I was a bit of a crossroads where it was like, if I keep studying people who are very different from me theologically, my heart for religion could turn to stone. And I need to either change careers, because I don't want to be a scholar whose direct subject matter has a heart of stone toward it, or I need to find something that will keep me attuned to what I find religiously moving, religiously musical, religiously possible. And this is a clip that for me exemplifies that. And it's from a sermon that Jim gives this sermon quite frequently on a biblical story about the death of the prophet Elijah and his student Elisha, who accompanies Elijah through the process of him dying. And this is a moment, and it's more sound than content, that is one of the things that I keep trying back to, and I'll just talk about it for 1 second after we finish playing it.
And what happens next is that Elijah says to Elisha, "Stay here, for God is sending me a little further to Bethel. Why don't you just stay here and I'll go on alone? We've had a great time together, but you don't need to go this last little distance with me." And Elisha says, "As God lives and as you yourself live, I will never leave you. I'll never leave you." And I believe Elijah understood that he was about to die or about to go through something very difficult. And it's because he loved Elisha that he was saying, "Oh, you don't have to do this. You really don't have to do this." And Elisha said, "I can't not." And that's part of what I experienced when I was in the hospital. It was kind of hard to see my friends acting panicked all the time, And I wanted to say to them, "You don't have to do this." But you know what? I was so grateful that they were there and that they did do this. And there's something about the connections we have with each other. That's where God appears. That's really where it happens. That's it. That's the theophany. That's the whirlwind. That's the still small voice. When we're able to stick through with each other in difficult times.
So I am a person who's had to work hard to be a person who shows up for people, and it's still not my first gift. And to find and have a touchstone of somebody not making any kind of great magical pronouncements about what a whirlwind is or what a theophany is, but that's it. It's showing up. It's being there when we can. That's where God appears. Like, that was something that was able to sort of get its way through my religion heart of stone. And so it's a real kind of touchstone for me.
Next clip is my clip, and there's a couple of reasons why I chose this. I think that, so I came out in San Francisco. No, really, I didn't come out in San Francisco. I came out in New Orleans, but it was because of San Francisco and moving to San Francisco and Berkeley that I came out. But it was much later in life. I wasn't like 18, 19. I was in my 30s. Everyone else seemed to know but me, kind of classic. I had grown up, though, in a really religious community, a real kind of evangelical Christian community. So there's a way in which this archive has been for me at least, has been really this deeply personal process of kind of thinking about who I am and what I've become. And so this clip is on it's from 1999. It's someone member of the church reading the Dyke March proclamation. And Jim, who you had just heard, introduces Leah, the person who's going to be reading the proclamation, by saying that this church believes in lesbian liberation. They were like, that's it. We just believe in this thing. We believe in lesbian liberation, which when you think about it, coming from my background, it's just kind of wild to hear from a pulpit. And so that's the other reason that I find this clip really fascinating, is that it's a very political clip. And my sociologist part of me was really fascinated in the way the church transformed over the course of the tapes that we listened to, from a very church forward to a very kind of political forward organization. And so this is from the later years in the archive.
I'd like to give you a really brief history of the Dyke March and how it got started. Before the 1993 March on Washington, some lesbian leaders around the country were expressing the need to do something to increase lesbian visibility and awareness of lesbian issues through that event. And they hoped that a couple of hundred women would show up. And it turns out that thousands and thousands of lesbian women marched from DuPont Circle to the Washington Monument that night before the 93 March on Washington. And I have had the great privilege to work with the core group of women who started it all, who are still on the San Francisco committee. This statement was written by Rebecca on the Dyke March committee. She delivered it last night at the rally, and she wrote it on behalf of the Dyke March committee, and it's my pleasure to share it with you this evening. Here's what she had to say. Welcome, women, to your Dyke March, the 7th annual San Francisco Dyke March. Right now, you are the world's largest dyke event, and you look fabulous. There are over 30,000 beautiful dykes here tonight. Remember that when you end up dating your ex-girlfriend's ex-girlfriend. Your Dyke March has always welcomed all women. From up here, I can see every kind of dyke I've ever heard of and a few new ones. I can see high femmes and stone butches, and baby dykes, and old dykes and middle-aged dykes who just came out this year. I can see disabled dykes, and I can see dykes of all colors. You are the dykes who dare. Dykes dare to demand more than equal rights. We demand the justice and equality that still do not exist for any woman or any person of color in this country. We dare to demand a world where housing and health care and education are available to everyone. Dykes are outraged by this year's spate of boys killing youths, but dykes also dare to end the silence about the countless assaults and murders of queer youth and trans youth and youth of color that the media have ignored. Dykes dare to create new ways of loving and honoring our love. Dykes dare to create families as we choose. We defend our right to adopt children, our right to inseminate, and every woman's right to abortion. This year, dykes will fight every law in the United States against our right to express ourselves sexually in the ways that we desire. But dykes will also dare to have plenty of hot sex with each other in the meantime. Dykes will dare to do what we want with our bodies. We will dare to have sex and dance and eat dessert and take time off. We will dare to vote and to commit civil disobedience and have babies and run for office and teach school and make dyke movies and write dyke poetry and defend ourselves and our sisters against violence and against hatred. We will dare to love each other through it all. Have a great march, and may all your orgasms be multiple.
My turn. The thing that you should know about Lynne, Siri, and I is that Lynne and Siri are scholars. I am not. I am the podcast producer in the group. So I'm going to do things a little differently. I'm going to play the clip first, and then I'm going to talk about it. The one thing I want to note is that my clip is kind of building on that theme that Siri mentioned briefly about this expansive time that these tapes cover and hearing different things at the beginning and the end. So Lynne, your tape was 90 or 89, is that right? Yeah, no.
My tape was actually 95. It was later.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Never mind then. Never mind. But this is that same person you heard in Lynne's tape. This is actually 94.
Last Monday night at Don Ramon's restaurant, a group of people who had been involved in MCC in the 1980s gathered together for dinner. And it was in the church bulletin, perhaps you saw it, and we invited anyone who was attending MCC in the 80s, whether they were coming anymore or not, to come together for dinner, to share stories and photographs, to remember, to celebrate, and to connect with one another. And it was a wonderful event. There were about 45 people who came and lots of pictures. We all got to pick one picture that we wanted to remove forever from the archives. It went back, many of these pictures went back even earlier into the 70s. But it was a wonderful time of remembering people who were there and people who had left, that we didn't know where they were anymore, and people who had died, all of that. We gathered in that restaurant for a meal, and we felt connection with them. We gather here every Sunday, and we feel that same connection with the people who've gone before us, the people that we don't know where they are, the people who live now with God, people who come here week after week. But this table is always here, and it has always been a place of communion, not only with God, but with each other. A place where time collapses, where past and present and future are all experienced at once. And on this anniversary day, we celebrate one of the most radical things that MCC ever did. And I don't know what it has to do with our being gay or lesbian or not. I can't even tell what it is exactly, but we say that when we gather at this table, everyone is welcome to come to it. And that may not sound radical, but the practice in 99% of Christian churches is that this table is the sign of who can come and who cannot come. It's the very symbol of the in and the out. And I think MCC's contribution to Christianity is manifold, but not to mention our sense of style is one. But I think equally important, our contribution to Christianity is that we have re-imaged this table, and now it's the symbol of the place where everyone is welcome, and not the symbol of who's in and who's out. That's what we celebrate today, too. 24 years of an important insight that I believe is helping to redeem Christianity. God is with you. And also with you. Let us lift up our hearts. We lift them up to God. Let us give God thanks and praise. It is a good and joyful thing to do. It is a good and joyful thing to do, always and everywhere, to give you thanks, loving God, creator of the universe. We give you thanks for all of the witnesses who have gone before us, people that we love, people whose names we remember at this time, as we name aloud the people who have been a part of this community, past and present, living and living with God.
Okay, so like Lynne said, we gave ourselves the assignment of what, or maybe Siri said it, what is keeping us going through this project? We've been doing it for 10 years. Like, what is a clip that we just can't get out of our teeth, if that's a metaphor? And this clip isn't in our project anywhere, but it is one that's really stuck with me and that I think about a lot. And the reason is, when we started working on this project, we had all of this tape, and I was like, okay, it's our job to somehow make sense of this, to like find the patterns and to turn them into story. And listening to this tape, it's so clear to me that the process of telling stories about themselves, the process of remembering what they've been through, is one of the most important works that they're doing as a church with AIDS. and they're remembering the people who have died. I cut off the tape before they spoke out the names of the people in the community who died, but that's a practice you hear over and over again in the tapes, them saying the names. And so I think what's so important to me is thinking of us as a continuation of something that they had started already. And the other thing that I really love in this tape is him talking about taking out a picture from the archive, because I think part of our work is like scrambling to try and to understand what it was like then. And I think that moment points to me to the silences, the things that we can never know, the stories that they're not going to tell us. And I think that's a really important thing to just kind of always hold close to yourself when you're trying to do something like make a story out of the archive. Yeah. I mean, the open communion piece is also so important. I was raised Jewish, so I had to learn from Lynn why it was so important that they allowed everyone up to the communion table, and why communion as a site of remembrance is so important intertwined with AIDS. I know it's not in our script, Lynn, but I'm wondering if you can just say something about that.
Yeah, I'll also add that I was also raised Jewish, so I had to learn it from people who grew up in Christianity and through academic classes. But what Jim says in that clip is historically accurate, that communion, which is one of the central sacraments, communion is a ritual that Jesus asked people to do in the Bible. It's taken from the Last Supper, the night before Jesus is crucified. The Bible story is told in a number of different places. He asks that people share bread and they share wine. Sometimes he says, "This is my body," about the bread, and "This is my blood." He says about the cup and asks them to share it in remembrance of him. And that is a core sacrament that you find in almost every Christian church. There are a few sacraments that are actually universal or close to universal in the wide range of Christian practice, but communion is one. And it historically, as Jim says, is the marker of who's in and who's out. In some traditions, you have to confess your sins and be absolved of them before you're able to present yourself for communion. In some cases, there are some sins that are considered so profound that if you do them, should not be allowed, like the officiant is actually required to forbid you to have access to it. It's a gatekeeping ritual that visually determines in a social space in front of all the people who has sufficient grace to be received and who is going to have to wait for another day when they clean up their godly act in order to be welcome at that table. And queer people, as you might imagine, particularly the folks who were attracted to MCC in the early days, which were mostly folks who couldn't pass. So queer people who were so queer that they were not going to pass as straight people or as cisgendered anything. The queer as a $3 bill people who just did not have places to hide in the conventional church, to say, no, this space is open to everybody. We're not going to even ask. We're not even going to ask you what you believe. And I will say personally, as a Jew, which I am, this is the only church I've ever taken communion in. And I have done it for a number of reasons, but the biggest one is before they give it, they say, you don't have to believe in anything. You don't have to believe in God. You don't have to believe in Jesus. You don't have to believe in anything. We do not care what you believe in. You're just welcome here. And it's like, well, okay. I mean, if those are the terms, then sure, then good. Great. Let's do it. Bread, wine, I'm into it. But it sounds, a number of liberal Protestant churches have adopted this kind of open table idea. And so in some circles, it doesn't sound as profound as it is, but to have queer people start that practice and to have them started in 1969 is really a transformative understanding of what this core Christian sacrament means.
Thank you, Lynn. Sorry for putting you on the spot. So the next piece of what we're going to talk about is how we started working with these tapes. And the first thing that happened was before Siri and I ever got involved, as Lynn mentioned, she was handed this incredible golden treasure trove and worked with incredible students at Berkeley to digitize a selection of those tapes, catalog them, label them, and start to code them. And Siri and I came in as Siri mentioned, I think towards the end of 2015, beginning of 2016. And I was a student of Lynne's at Harvard Divinity School, and I think I was lucky enough to be the only podcast producer she knew. So she turned to me and she said, I have all of this audio. It's amazing. I think people have to listen to it. And my dear friend Siri keeps telling me that maybe it should be a podcast. You're a podcast producer. What do you think? Do you want to try and make something out of it with me? And I jumped at the opportunity. I said, absolutely, sign me up for 10 years. And
As we all did.
yeah. And Siri and Lynn and I, the first thing we did was we just started getting together to listen and to think about what it could possibly mean to make stories out of this. But listening to the tapes and talking about it, I think it's like the first 5 years was just trying to get our brains around what was in it because there was so much content. And Lynn had done this amazing job of giving us an abbreviated, so she had this big catalog. She created like an abbreviated archive of selections that she thought were representative, the major players, the major events in the church, Christmas, Easter, the themes of the sermons. And so we collectively, I think, had something like 580 clips that we were that were like our archive that we decided we needed to familiarize ourselves with in order to think about making a project out of it. Siri, do you want to take it from there?
Yeah. Yeah. And so one of the big questions was like, okay, Lynn had like organized it by year. And then there was like there was a multiple like foldering, by year, by like person, and we thought we needed to have, if we were really going to use this archive to tell a story, because it's so big. And we knew we would be adding to it as well. This was just like the initial group of clips. Once we would begin to think about the stories we wanted to tell, we'd need to add, hundreds more. And so started setting up an Airtable. And I'm a Virgo, and I like really love setting up systems like that. And then the great thing is that Lynn loves to fill in the systems. So I designed a very, a kind of robust Airtable that could Airtable is, for any of you who have used it, it's like a relational database that you can use for free up till a certain point. So we've just managed to figure out how to keep using it for free. And then in conversation with Ariana and Lynn, we we took away columns. We just kind of made it so that it was really something that could be, that could facilitate telling the story and give us something, a way to both do some kind of coding as well as, just thinking about how we relate. I mean, we had like long conversations about okay, what is our nomenclature? How are we going to label these things? Are we going to start with the year? Are we going to start with this? Are we going to start, and each of those conversations, I mean, for you all, that probably you're going to be like, yes, I understand. But every time we had a conversation about how to do something in the process, it was also a conversation about how we're going to be telling the story. So, once we had that and we were kind of meeting regularly, we also did a few smaller projects along the way as a way to begin to think if we could tell a story that people would want to hear. And so we did a couple, Lynn and I did some conferences, and then we also collectively, the three of us did a kind of online exhibit for the American Religious Sounds Project, and a couple of smaller podcast one-offs. And yeah, so that we're kind of working through both the kind of thinking about it as a whole and slowly trying to see, can we do this?
The other thing I think it's important to say is that Lynn, before we started to make a podcast, Lynn was starting to write a book on this topic. And so Lynn was doing interviews with a lot of people who were formerly part of this congregation, a lot of people who were touching this story. And so when Siri and I came to the project, I think there were something like 80 interviews that Lynne had done for her book that were really just oral histories that were, tell me, where were you raised? How did you, what was your religious life like? How did you come to MCC? And so another part of what we had to do together was figure out, can those tapes that Lynne made for her book become audio that we use for the podcast? Sometimes it was yes, a lot of times it was no, because the quality of the recordings. So then we also started a process of re-interviewing a lot of the people that Lynne talked to originally for the podcast project as well. And then the other thing I'll say about how we came to start working together and what that looked like is that at the beginning I mentioned that we are a collective. I think we're still, and maybe we'll always be figuring out what that means, but what we mean by that in this moment is that all of our decisions about the project are made collectively, that there isn't any hierarchy to our organization, even though it was a project that Lynne came in with. Anytime we decide what the music is going to sound like, who we want to hire, anything like that, the three of us are making those decisions together. I think a lot of that came about because none of us had made a narrative podcast series before, and so there was some sense of relying on one another to like have some consensus to be like, okay, no, this is really a good idea. Okay, this is really a good idea. We all think it is. But I also think it's created a really beautiful working dynamic that is a little bit unique in the audio field. And we have found that when we have talked to people about their project, they've been like, okay, but like who's the executive producer? Like who's making the decisions? And we've somehow found a way so far to not have any conflict around that.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing too is that I'm in Providence, Ariana is in Chicago, and Lynne is in San Francisco. So, you know, it's been very important that communication has been central to the way that we do it, and like open communication, because we do live so far away. So even this presentation today that we're doing for you was like, we met 3 times. Well, you two met. I almost went 2.5 times my turn. But like we were meeting and we decide like what we had a conversation about the clips that we were choosing. Like we just kind of do it automatically about almost everything that we do. So for the last piece that we're going to do, is it the last piece? I mean, there's at least the last like audio piece. We have a clip. And what we thought we would do is play this clip for you. It's one we collectively chose. It has meaning for all of us in some way. And then talk about our own kind of, in some ways, disciplinary lens that we understand this through, and how, just to give you a sense of the way in which we do work the archive together as we're listening, and the kind of things that we're thinking about and how they might be different. So I'm going to go to the next clip and then play it for you all. This is some music.
Our first hymn tonight is number 259. Let's all stand to our feet, please, and join the singing When the Roll is Called Up Yonder. come on, where have you been?
So we're talking about the different things we hear in this song, and I'll go first. So our project is called When We All Get to Heaven, and it's called that because When We All Get to Heaven is a hymn that they sang a lot at the church. And listening to When the Roll is Called Up Yonder, it evokes a lot of the same things for me as When We All Get to Heaven. It is a song about dying and going to heaven, and it is an exuberant song about that. And I think for me, from like a narrative podcaster perspective, like that's the most salient thing about this is that like you're like, oh yeah, Christian, oh yeah, fun, and then you're like, oh yeah, a group of people with AIDS dying, singing about going to heaven, and they're doing it in this specific tenor, and like there's just like a little bit of friction there, a little bit of interest there that I find really compelling and that really hooks me. And then, of course, the ending. How many of you have never heard that song before in your life? Oh, come on, where have you been? Right? It's this, you get a sense immediately kind of who this man is, what it's like to be in a church with him. But also like that he's saying like this is pop culture, baby. Like where have you been? How do you not know this song? But what he's talking about is church. So that's so endearing to me. How about you, Siri?
For me, one of the things that I hear with a lot of the songs, especially in the early years, so this is from 1989. And Lynn will talk a little bit probably about kind of its particular context. But it's from the kind of the earlier part of the archive that we're mostly using, which starts predominantly 1987 with a couple of clips earlier, but it's really 87 that it begins and goes through about 2000. And so this is the earlier time. It is before, like, the 90s were really tough around AIDS, but this church is still in the midst of it. And I mean, it still is really in the midst of it because it is in the Castro. And so it's seen things that, maybe even other communities would take a little bit longer. But the thing that I hear is just like how church revival this thing sounds. And having grown up in a religious evangelical community, like at first, I'm like, whoa, I am not in that community anymore. It's not a community that's particularly welcoming to LGBTQ folks. So as you know, I came out, it's like, I'm not a part of the church anymore. So for me, I'm like, this is real Christian. This is like tent revival stuff. But as Ariana pointed out, the piano bar quality of it is definitely not church revival. And so there's this just like wonderful, like mixture of genres, if you will, that are evident in this song. And somehow just, I mean, like, every time I hear it, I'm like, dun, 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 like, and I was looking at almost even Sarah. He's like, couldn't help it. This like, there's so much of the archive is like that. You hear it and you're just like that, I love that song. So anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Lynn to talk about its like deeper particular meaning.
So Ariana hears story and character and tension, and Siri hears genre and queer mixing and exuberance. And I am the history nerd in the family. So when I listened to this tape, what I knew was that this tape was from a recording of a service when the National Council of Churches came to visit MCC San Francisco. I'm going to try to refrain from giving you a whole lecture about this, but I'm going to give you the short version. So the National Council of Churches was at the time the largest Protestant organization in the United States. It was like it still exists, but at the time it's like a coalition organization of all of of many, many, many Protestant denominations, moderate to liberal, generally speaking, and a lot of the Orthodox immigrant churches. So the Greek Orthodox, not the Russian Orthodox, but the Greek Orthodox, some other Orthodox. And in the 80s, in the early 80s, before AIDS was a thing, MCC decided that it was going to test the faith of its fellow Christians by trying to become a member, one in a number of denominations of this great Christian organization open to all the denominations. Hi, we're Gay Church. Will you please let us be a member of your denominations? We'd like to pay you dues and come to your really boring annual meeting every year. It would be great. Please have us. They get into a big fight. It doesn't happen. The National Council of Churches is not ready to accept a gay church and a gay identified church into its august company. Great. But there's like a strand or a stream of like radical theologians. Some of them are in the closet, some of them are not, some of them are queer, some of them are not. A lot of them are inspired by liberation theology. A lot of them are radicals who are thinking about AIDS and are thinking about what's happening in AIDS, with AIDS, and wanting to learn more. And there's a minister at MCC San Francisco, a guy named Ron Russell Kuntz, who's like, I have AIDS. The church needs to be talking about this. You folks are pathetic, and we need to have a way to be in conversation. Ron Russell Kuntz gets himself on a committee in the National Council of Churches with some of these people, and they maneuver a way for a group from the National Council of Churches to come visit at Metropolitan Community Church of San Francisco for an evening to quote unquote learn about AIDS. Let's be clear, this is 1989. AIDS emerged in 1981. This is not the rapid response network of emergency Christian responses to like torment and disease. This is like the slow ride. But they came, and this song was the opening hymn sung that Friday night when the National Council of Churches came to visit this church. So when I hear this, in addition to hearing a bunch of gay men insisting that they're going to heaven and a bunch of sick men who may die very quickly saying, we're going to go to heaven and I'm going to be there, I hear them saying to like leaders of all of these mainline, august, respectable Christian denominations saying, I see it as like an opening salvo in like some kind of like slow roll churchy battle rap or something, being like, when the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. Like, you are all going to have to stand. You're all going to have to sing it with me. And I'm going to say to you all, National Council of Churches, when the roll is called up yonder, I'm going to be there. I know you don't think that we belong in your organization. I know you don't think we belong in our church, but here you're visiting tonight, and it's like this symbolic, it's a symbolic throwing down of the gauntlet. If you're going to sit with us, you're going to have to sing and be in that. And then the very last bit, Jack being like, how many of you have never heard your song in your life? That is also a deep insider baseball religious jab. The National Council of Churches, as I mentioned, is kind of the liberal mainline kind of your Presbyterians, your Lutherans, your Methodists. Jack and a lot of folks in this song, you can hear it. Like Siri said, it comes from revival. It comes from evangelicals, Pentecostals. Evangelicals and Pentecostals, they weren't part of the National Council of Churches. They were considered too low church, too conservative, blah, 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 blah. This is the most rousing Pentecostal, like revival type church. So he's digging at these mainline people. Have you never heard this song? And you call yourself Christians? You're Christian leaders? You've never heard when the roll is called up yonder? Like, get over it. So one of the questions that we've had to wrangle in sort of thinking about the different ways each of us hear this, and one of the things that I personally had to really wrangle with is how to move from academic argument. I could write you a very compelling paper right now about the symbolism, blah, 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 yada, 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 contribution to history. Great, thanks for playing. You do not want to listen to that in your headphones, me saying that for more than 2 seconds. You probably are done with me doing that at this point already. You don't need me to write a 30-page paper that meets academic criteria about why this is fascinating. We need to tell a story. And so part of what's been so fruitful about our collaboration is sort of the synergy back and forth between what our sort of academic and intellectual expectations are, what our narrative storytelling ideas are, what our aesthetics are. And it's something that we've worked on together, and that we've also really worked in collaboration with Sarah to really kind of develop a way to sort of hold all of those imperatives of this project in one place in a way that will be compelling, because as I keep telling myself personally, a lot more people, even if nobody listens to it, it's going to be a lot more people than have ever going to read an academic book about it. So let's keep going in this direction. I'll leave it there.
I am kind of attentive to the time, and I'm wondering, Lynn and Ariana, if we show our little thank you slide, because someone asked if the Dyke March was available, and I was like, it's on Instagram. So can I show the thank you and then maybe make us all big, and then we can either address the last comment, the last section that we wanted to do, talking about our relationship with the community. We can fold that into the Q&A, or, I don't know. But does that work for
Yeah,
us?
great.
If I go here's our thank you. Follow us at eureka.street, and heavenpodcast.org is our website.
I'll tell you, it's not very active right now, Eureka.Street, but
No, it's
come
not.
June, when the podcast launches, look out.
But follow us now if you want to, or go
Exactly,
there
so that you remember in June to listen to the podcast.
Yes. All right, let me close up the share so we can come in much larger.
So we had some comments in the chat about how one goes about preserving the history. So I think it's really important before we end to touch on the amazing work Lynne has done donating this archive and all of her oral history work to the San Francisco Public Library. Lynne, do you mind just saying something about that?
Yeah, so one aspect of this work, I mean, we're going to mention at the end anyway, is our relationship with this community. And while this is not exactly a community collaboration, MCC doesn't have a say in what we say. We are partners with the community in not just preserving the history they have, but building a robust archive that will document this church in all its dimensions. I often think of it as like building a set of breadcrumbs for future historians and scholars and artists to find other ways. We're going to tell one version of this story, but we haven't heard 3/4 of the tapes in this collective. There's a million ways to tell this story, and we're just going to do one. But part of what we have committed to from the beginning is preserving and building this archive. So part of our work has been working with the congregation, with MCC San Francisco, to get them to donate these tapes and their papers, the existing papers that they had, to the San Francisco Public Library. And then as part of that, so what we've done is built it's like the Trinity, like a 3-in-1 archive, where we also have worked with a man named Lynne Jordan, who is the longest standing church member and the official church historian, to donate his collection of papers as sort of Section 2 of the MCC San Francisco archive. And then I'm Section 3 of the MCC archive, and I'm kind of like the random material generator. So I do a lot of oral histories, many of which are never going to see the light of day in a project, in this podcast or anything else. Given that people who are involved in this history are meeting the end of their natural lifespans, if I see somebody who has a story, I interview them and stick it in the archive, and I'm like, somebody's going to do something with this. It ain't me, but it's going to be somebody. So here it goes. And I also gather other people's papers and other people's stuff. And over the years, I've come across somebody who's been like, oh, I have this random thing in my thing, or like my brother gave me this object, or I had this scrapbook. I don't know what to do with it. Do you want it? They send it to me, and then it gets folded into the MCC San Francisco archive through my kind of, the part of the MCC San Francisco archive that's in my name. So we think about building the archive alongside creating a podcast and alongside preserving this history. Like, we want to expand it, and we want to expand the different ways in that people might have in the future. So we work closely with the church and the library about building that collection.
Thank you all so much for this presentation. I have many questions. I'm sure the audience does as well. And so I want to open it up to Q&A. Maybe I'll start. And folks, you're welcome to type up questions and put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I'll call on you. We have about 15-ish minutes or so. I think that the question that I'm curious about is, obviously this archive is huge. Y'all have listened to so much of it. And in some ways it seems like it's a living archive and that you continue to add to it as well. And so I'm curious, how did you sort of begin to think about what you would include, what stories, right? Or I can almost kind of hesitate to use that term, but like, how did you decide which parts of the sort of experience that is captured in those tapes, the experience of the congregation? How did you sort of decide what you wanted to highlight or what you wanted to explore?
I'm going to start the answer and then I'm going to pass it on, because the first decision in that is, what do you digitize of a collection of 1,200, knowing that you're not going to be able to. And so it started before Ariana and Siri and I started working together, in me and my Berkeley students trying to figure out, what do you sample? Because we only are going to listen to so much of it. So we did 2 samples of tapes. One was a sample that tried to get at the range and diversity of experience. So we had a formula. I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was like 1 service every month. For every month, there was a service. And for each year, there was a formula. So it was like 6 morning services, 6 evening services, not more than a quarter from a senior pastor, and then some number for women pastor. I don't remember what the exact calculation was, but we did something that tried to simulate like a random sample, and that would give us kind of moments in time that would give us the span of the story. And then we had a kind of selective sample that was like every Christmas, every Easter, every memorial service, every random thing that I didn't know what it was. So like there were this thing called HIV survivors and thrivers, which turned out to be like some panel that happened one evening. All the things that I couldn't figure out from whatever they called it on the box, what it was, I just stuck it in that selected the selected sample, and I figured that that would also give us a sense of some of the other kinds of events that happened. And also we really wanted, they're not that, given how many memorial services were performed in that church, excuse me, there weren't that many recordings of memorial services, so I wanted to hear all of them.
So we did this process before we went into production where we got really obsessed with being able to, all of us, navigate our Airtable, all of our clips with dexterity. And so we decided we had to do this intense listening process where we each took sections of the archive and we would spend time listening. Like I remember I had sermons and I would listen to a section of the sermons in the archive, and then I would come back and give a presentation to Lynne and Siri about what I had listened to, and specifically the things that I thought were like the most interesting in the tapes. And that was like part of our coding. We would say, this probably isn't going to be in this project, but then there was like a selection of maybes and a selection of like, ooh, well, we feel like this is really good tape or really juicy. It's bringing up something that we have to talk about. And then we kind of just like started laying out all of those things on the table. I think, Siri, you came up with a great metaphor. It was constellations, what do you remember?
Constellations was one of them. I don't remember exactly what it was. I was like, yeah, something constellations. What was the other one?
I think we had like 3 tiers where we were like,
Some celestial one.
yeah, a celestial metaphor for how we were like putting this tape in what we thought was important and how we could start relating it to other tape that we were listening to. And like for this project, a lot of it comes down to what we have enough tape to tell. Because there's so many things that we think are important. There's so many pieces that are like beautiful but one-off, but can't make a whole episode. And so it was really organic. We just like kept like gathering and like putting it on the table and being like, oh wait, that thing you played reminded me of this thing I played earlier, until things started to build. I don't know, Siri, how would you talk about it?
Yeah, well, I'm thinking about how an early idea that we had that we were really convinced we're going to do is this NCC visit. And we developed at a very extensive like clips and the whole outline of what this episode about when NCC came. We were like, it's classic, like little church and big church, David and Goliath, if you will, and there was a way in which, but in the end, it wasn't a story that we, that ended up kind of coming out, but instead what did come out was a much more personal story about the preacher, Ron Russell Coons, who Lynn mentioned. And so, and that one kind of, that was something that like unfolded as we were doing this. And it helped that we had this really amazing interview that Lynn did with his brother, which just had these like moments in it that were just so poignant. And the story felt his story as part of this church. There felt like there was something fundamental about that relationship, his relationship with his family, that it needed to be told as part of this story. So, there were some kind of moments that were like, oh yeah, this is definitely going to be a story, but then others that kind of emerged as we were really doing the work. So it was a little of like iterative and what's the other word? The not iterative word.
The other thing I'll say is part of it comes from the interviews, right? Like if there are stories that more than one person are telling and are people that they're bringing up, I think it's easy to let that direct our attention and say, okay, then this must have been important. If several people remember a specific funeral, then we have to think about telling that story, because for them that's a part of what is remembered. Lynn?
And also, as we listen over and over and over, we can start to trace people. So there's some people where you hear XYZ is in the hospital, XYZ is glad that his mother's here, XYZ is in the hospital again, XYZ's memorial is next week, here are the flowers of the anniversary of XYZ's death. This is the 10th anniversary of when XYZ used to sit in the front pew. Like, you can hear, the more that we just saturated ourselves in that, the more the pieces of tape we were able to connect pieces of tape about a story that doesn't immediately present itself in any one Sunday, but because we know the whole so well, we can start to make the connections.
Thank you. I see a number of questions in the chat here. I'm going to try to, there was a few of them. So I'm going to read one, and then if anyone wants to raise their hand, I'll try to go back and forth. So someone writes, also, I see a question about the recording. I assume you mean the recording for this event, which will be uploaded in the next few days. So question from Lynette says, thanks for the wonderful project. If there's time, recent scholarship on the early AIDS crisis has flagged other populations hard hit, incarcerated people whose life worlds cross with IV drug users, to name two examples. Are there other such examples of churches that have had relationships to those kinds of communities? Is anyone working on that?
Oh my God, there's so much work to be done in this area. I can't even tell you. If you're interested, please do it. My God. So one of the things that happens in this work is that you find stories that, because we are doing this story, we do not have time to adequately address. So one of my favorite stories is, or one of the stories that I'm most interested in, because my work is in San Francisco, is a woman named Glenda Hope, who is a Presbyterian minister, who did work. She did funerals for IV drug users in the, the residential hotels in the Tenderloin. So she was like a street pastor and funeral guide in these spaces where a lot more trans folks were impacted than in the Castro. A lot more IV drug users were impacted. She was involved in other folks. So there were some people in the AIDS world in San Francisco who were able to sort of traverse the different spaces where AIDS was really happening, from the white gay male community, which, as we might imagine, could be very segregated and very concerned about its own business, and the wide range of other communities that were infected, which in San Francisco really is the intravenous drug using population was the most significant. Also the trans community. So there were some AIDS figures who were really able to traverse those spaces. And so figures like a man named Hank Wilson worked with Glenda Hope and founded the Tenderloin AIDS Network, which didn't represent itself as a church, but in fact had this really intense spiritual base. And I think there's a thing, this is another thing that I haven't had a chance to write more about, but I think there's a way in which a lot of AIDS organizations became de facto spiritual organizations or religious organizations because there was no other place. And I think this is particularly true with Black AIDS organizations. In San Francisco, there was a group called the Rafiki Project, which brought together Black church folks and indigenous African practitioners and alternative Black spiritualists together. And it became a real spiritual space for that kind of sort of ecumenical isn't even the word, like inter-spiritual conversation when there was no Black church that was going to have that conversation. There was no other religious organization in that community that was big enough to have the resources to even think about that conversation. But AIDS organizations became those spaces, and I think there's work to be done in how AIDS organizations became religious and spiritual organizations. And I think that's where you can access some of the communities that don't show up in a place that looks like a church with a person that looks like a pastor and a thing that looks like a pew and music that sounds like an organ. That religious life happens. It just happens. It happens in all the places. But how to trace it with other communities who were so marginal they didn't even have the ability to create their own churches, right? Like that was not even something that was going to happen. There's traces, and then there's more traces to follow for sure.
Want to open it up to a hand or two before I go back to the chat here. Don't be shy. We're all friends here. Or do be. I mean, I can't, If you're going to be shy, I guess the Zoom meeting. Yeah, Tejan.
Hi, I can just say my question out loud. I typed it in the chat, but I'll say it out loud. Hi, I'm Tajan. Thank you so much for sharing this really amazing work. I just had a question on just how you maintain the trust with the community, because you spoke, Lynn, about initially just how being handed the tapes, basically just that it was kind of this golden trove. I think you used the word, Ariana, golden trove of these treasures. But like, how did you maintain that over the years, and also within that, if there was like some pushback, any pushback?
I'll take that one. I'll give you a short answer to what is a long story, but I will say that since 2001, when I was first introduced to MCC San Francisco, the church has been in a very, very sharp decline and has had a lot of leaders, has had a very, very steep drop in membership. It moved from the Castro and is now located in other places around the city, and it's had multiple leaders, and it has, I think there's been 8 different senior pastors at that church since I got the tapes in 2011. So, and it's had a hard couple of decades. That said, one of the things that they are not confused about, or they're not fighting amongst themselves about, is the desire to preserve this history, to make sure that it's available. So we've been lucky enough that that is one of the few places of unity in the church, and it's also one of the few places that every leader in this church has been very clear on wanting to shepherd, particularly as the church has gotten smaller and smaller, and it's moved and moved and moved. Like those tapes lasted a couple of moves before we finally got it to the library, because the person who was the pastor at the time was like, I am leaving in 3 weeks. These tapes will leave this building and go into the library in 3 weeks, period, end of sentence. Like it's a combination of a church not being divided around that, and ministers being like, well, the church isn't divided about that, but they're in a hard space, so I am going to make sure you move these from one place to another. That's not a quite carrot stick thing. I don't know what the metaphor is, but you know what I mean. But I mean, and we've also talked to a lot of people who are no longer members of the church, who no longer consider themselves active, some who had very active fights and disagreements with some of the people that we feature for many, many years. Like, there's drama, but there's been no formal pushback. I mean, even the person who introduced the tapes to me, his only request was that we not use his name publicly because he doesn't like to be on the internet. Yeah.
I'll say 2 more things. One is that the 3 of us did go and give a presentation to the church at one point, and we did a series of like open house interviews, like anyone who wanted to come and tell their stories to us. Like we hung out and interviewed them. And Lynne, I mean, not to like hype you up, but I think has done this really amazing work with the people who she's interviewed of like continuing to be in contact with them. I'm thinking of one person in particular who it feels like has reached out to Lynne several times to be like, I'd like to keep talking to you. I have more to say about my experience. And Lynne continues to go back and record those stories because it has become, I don't know, like a process of healing for him to tell the stories to Lynne. And I think like thinking about our responsibility back to these people who are giving us these stories is really important. And it's really Lynne who's doing that work that I think is amazing.
I just had one thing, which is when I very first started this project, there was a guy named Jimmy on the board who like cornered me, was like, if you think you're coming in here for a year, taking our stories and making your name, you can fucking turn around and get out of here right now. And that was in 2011. It was the best support for taking a slow approach, which, as many of you know, no audio production company is going to support, no academic tenure track blah blah department is going to support, no one will support except ourselves, us who know how to do this work and care about these communities, the kind of time and patience and relationship building and sticking with it that I think is the great gift of doing this kind of work, is the great possibility of it and the source of what integrity it has that we hope that it has, I mean, it's, sticking together. That's it. That's the theophany. That's the still small voice. That's what we got,